The August heat hung heavy over Dothan, Alabama, as I sat on the veranda of my bungalow, the peeling blue paint catching the late afternoon sun. My hands, still strong at 70, rested on the armrest of my wicker chair, the wood worn smooth by years of evenings spent here. The air smelled of magnolias, their creamy blooms nodding along the fence line, planted decades ago when my husband, James, was still alive. He'd carried the saplings home in burlap sacks, his smile as bright as the summer sky, promising they'd outlast us both. Now those trees stood tall, their roots deep in the red clay, while James was gone and I was left to tend the life we'd built. My bungalow was modest, a single-story haven with creaking floorboards and windows that stuck in the humidity. Inside, the walls held memories, framed photos of my parents, a quilt I'd sewn for my son Darren's 5th birthday, a faded sketch of the church where James and I married. Outside, my garden thrived, rows of collards, tomatoes, and zinnias I'd coaxed from the earth with sweat and patience. That morning, I'd spend hours weeding, my knees sinking into the soil, the sun warming my back. Neighbors often stopped by, drawn by the scent of my peach cobbler cooling on the kitchen counter. I'd send them home with a slice, their thanks warming me more than the oven. 3 months earlier, Darren, my only child, had arrived with his wife, Miranda, and their daughter, Tessa. Their restaurant in Montgomery had collapsed under bad loans and worse decisions, leaving them drowning in debt. Darren's voice had cracked over the phone when he asked to move in, his pride bruised. I didn't hesitate. I cashed out most of my savings, nearly $30,000, to pay off their creditors, leaving my account thin, but my heart full. I wanted my family close, the house alive with voices again. Tessa, 16 and sharp as a whip, was my joy. She'd sprawl on the living room rug, her notebook open, reading me poems about rivers and stars while we shelled peas. Her words painted worlds I'd never seen, and I'd listen, marveling at her fire. But the house felt different now. Darren, at 45, carried a heaviness I didn't recognize. He'd always been quiet, like his father, but this was deeper, a silence that swallowed conversation. At dinner, he'd sit hunched over his plate, his fork scraping the porcelain, his eyes fixed on his phone. Miranda, with her manicured nails and perfume that lingered like a warning, filled the silence with complaints. The kitchen was too small, she'd say, or the ceiling fan too loud. She'd glance at my lace curtains, yellowed with age, and sigh, her lips pursed. I'd smile, stirring the gravy, telling myself she was just tired. But her sighs piled up, each one a stone in my chest. That morning, I'd baked cornbread, the recipe my mother taught me, and set the table with my good plates. Tessa bounded in, her braids swinging, and hugged me, her warmth chasing the unease. She chatted about school, her poetry club, a boy who'd smiled at her in math class. Darren ate quickly, mumbling about a job interview, though he'd said the same last week and returned empty-handed. Miranda picked at her food, her phone propped against her glass, scrolling through listings for houses I knew they couldn't afford. I watched them, my family, and felt a distance I couldn't name. The night before, I'd woken to footsteps in the hall. The clock read 2 a.m., and the house was still, save for the hum of cicadas outside. I slipped out of bed, my nightgown brushing my calves, and crept to the living room. Darren and Miranda stood by the bookshelf, their voices low. I pressed myself against the wall, the plaster cool against my skin, and listened. Miranda's whisper was sharp, like glass. This house is worth more than she thinks. With the market now, we could sell it, start fresh. It's our chance. Darren's response was a murmur, too soft to catch, but it wasn't a no. My breath caught, my pulse loud in my ears. I waited until they moved to their room before returning to bed, my mind racing. They hadn't seen me, hadn't known I'd heard. By morning, the memory sat heavy, like a storm cloud over the veranda. I sipped my coffee, the mug warm in my hands, and watched a cardinal dart through the magnolias. Tessa was at school, her backpack slung over one shoulder as she'd left, waving from the gate. Darren had driven off an hour ago, his truck kicking up dust on the gravel road. Miranda was inside, her laughter sharp as she talked on the phone, the words renovation and profit slipping through the open window. I set my mug down, the porcelain clinking against the table, and stood, my joints protesting. The veranda creaked under my steps as I walked to the edge, my eyes tracing the garden, the house, the life I'd poured into this place. Inside, I crossed the living room, the rug soft under my bare feet, and knelt by the cedar chest in the corner. It was James's, carved with his initials, a wedding gift from his uncle. I lifted the lid, the hinges groaning, and pulled out a metal box, its lock rusted but intact. Inside were the deeds to the house, my will, and a few letters from James, their ink faded. I ran my fingers over the deed, the paper crisp despite its age. My name, Evelyn Marie Wilson, was typed in bold, the sole owner since James's passing. I checked the lock, ensuring it held, and tucked the box back into the chest. The act felt like a ritual, a quiet vow to myself. I returned to the veranda, the heat pressing closer now, and settled back into my chair. A breeze stirred the magnolias, their petals drifting to the ground. I thought of Darren as a boy, running through this yard, his laughter bright. I'd worked double shifts at the textile factory to buy this house, my hands raw from the machines. My nights spent praying he'd have a better life. Now he sat in my kitchen, plotting to take it. Miranda's words echoed in my mind, her voice a blade. I didn't know what they'd do next, but I felt it coming, like thunder before rain. My hands tightened on the chair, my resolve hardening. This was my home, my roots. Whatever they planned, I'd be ready. The morning after I overheard Miranda's whisper about selling my house, I woke to the scent of coffee brewing in the kitchen, its bitter warmth filling the bungalow. I lay in bed, the quilt heavy across my chest, staring at the ceiling where a water stain bloomed from last year's storm. The quiet was unnatural, broken only by the distant clink of a spoon against a mug. I rose, my bare feet cold on the hardwood, and pulled on a cotton dress, its hem frayed from years of wear. In the kitchen, I poured coffee into my favorite mug, the one with the chipped handle, and stood by the window, watching the magnolias sway in the early breeze. The Dothan sun was already climbing, promising another day of heat that would cling to my skin. At the breakfast table, the silence cut deeper than usual. Darren sat across from me, his broad shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on his phone. He wore a faded polo shirt, the same one he'd worn when he moved in, its collar stained with sweat. He hadn't shaved in days, and the stubble on his jaw made him look older than his 45 years. Miranda, perched at the table's end, sipped her coffee, her nails clicking against the mug. She complained about the heat, her voice sharp, saying the bungalow felt like an oven, too cramped for 3 adults and a teenager. I stirred sugar into my coffee, my spoon scraping the porcelain, and hummed a line from an old hymn, Amazing Grace, a habit that steadied me. Miranda's eyes flicked toward me, her lips tightening, and she muttered that my singing was distracting. I stopped, my fingers still on the spoon, and forced a smile. Tessa shuffled in, her sneakers scuffing the floor, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She dropped into a chair, her braids swinging, and reached for a biscuit I'd baked the night before. "Ba, you okay?" she asked, her brown eyes searching mine. She always saw through me, my Tessa, her poet's heart catching what others missed. I nodded, patting her hand, but inside, a storm churned. Miranda's words from the night before echoed, her talk of my house's value of starting fresh. Darren's silence then, and now, felt like agreement. I watched him scroll through his phone, his thumb moving mechanically, and wondered when my son had become a stranger. Darren stood, abruptly, mumbling about things to do, and left without meeting my gaze. His truck rumbled to life outside, the gravel crunching as he drove off. Miranda lingered, her phone now open to a real estate app, images of sleek condos flashing across the screen. She didn't speak to me, her attention fixed on her plans I wasn't part of. Tessa grabbed her backpack and hugged me before heading to school, her warmth a fleeting comfort. Alone with Miranda, I busied myself washing dishes, the hot water stinging my hands, my mind replaying every glance, every sigh. That evening, After Tessa returned and Miranda retreated to her room, I noticed the trash can by the back door was overflowing. I tied the bag, my hand steady despite the unease gnawing at me, and carried it to the bin outside. As I lifted the lid, a folded paper caught my eye, half buried under coffee grounds. I pulled it out, wiping it clean, and unfolded it under the porch light. It was a letter from First Alabama Bank, addressed to Darren, requesting an appraisal of my property. His signature, bold and looping, stared back at me. My breath hitched. He hadn't mentioned this, not a word. I tucked the letter into my apron pocket, my heart pounding, and returned inside, the screen door creaking shut. In my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress sagging under my weight, and pulled out a leather-bound notebook from my nightstand. It was old, its pages yellowed, used years ago to track grocery lists and James's medical bills. Now it would hold something else. I wrote the date August 12th, 2022, and detailed what I'd heard. Miranda's whisper, Darren's murmur, the letter I'd found. I noted Miranda's sighs, her complaints about the house, the way she lingered in the living room that afternoon, snapping photos with her phone as if measuring the space. My pen moved quickly, the ink smudging under my grip, each word a tether to my resolve. The next morning, I drove to the Dothan Public Library, my old Buick rattling over the potholed roads. The library's air conditioning was a relief, cooling the sweat on my brow as I signed into a computer. I searched the county records, my fingers clumsy on the keyboard, and confirmed the deed to my bungalow was still in my name, Evelyn Marie Wilson, unchallenged since James's death. Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. The letter, Miranda's photos, Darren's avoidance, they were pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve, but couldn't ignore. That evening, Miranda waited for me in the living room, her arms crossed, her smile too bright. She suggested we talk about my future, her voice syrupy, like she was selling something. She sat on the couch, her skirt smoothed over her knees, and spoke of modern senior apartments, places with comfort and care. She said it would be easier for me, safer, as if my home was a burden I couldn't carry. I stood by the fireplace, my hands clasped, and listened, my face calm. "I'm fine here, Miranda," I said, my voice firm but polite. "This is my home." She blinked, her smile faltering, and glanced at Darren, who'd just walked in. He stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, saying nothing. Tessa, curled in an armchair with her notebook, looked up, her eyes wide with worry. Miranda pressed on, mentioning options and family needs, but I shook my head, ending the conversation. She left the room, her heels clicking, and Darren followed, still silent. I sat with Tessa afterward, the lamplight casting shadows on the walls. She didn't speak, just leaned against me, her notebook open to a half-written poem. I stroked her hair, my mind racing. The letter, Miranda's photos, her talk of senior homes, it was all connected. My house, my life's work was their target. I didn't know how far they'd go, but I knew I had to protect what was mine. My notebook, tucked back in the nightstand, was my first step. Tomorrow, I'd call someone who could help, someone who understood the law. For now, I held Tessa close, the weight of her trust anchoring me against the storm I felt coming. The week after Miranda's talk of senior apartments passed in a haze, each day heavier than the last. I moved through my bungalow like a ghost, tending my garden, cooking meals, but my mind was elsewhere, tethered to the letter from the bank and Miranda's photographs of my home. The Dothan heat pressed against the windows, and the air inside felt thick with unspoken words. I kept my notebook close, its pages filling with notes, dates, snippets of conversation, the way Darren's eyes slid away from mine at breakfast. I needed answers, something solid to hold against the fear gnawing at me. I called Clara Thompson, my friend of 30 years, on a Monday morning. She was a retired attorney, sharp as ever at 72, with a voice that could calm a storm or start one. I stood in my bedroom, the phone cord twisted around my finger, and told her about the bank letter, Miranda's whispers, the talk of selling my house. Clara listened, her silence steady, and promised to dig into my financial records. By Wednesday, she called back, her tone clipped. Darren had filed for power of attorney at the county courthouse, claiming I was incapacitated and unable to manage my affairs. He'd submitted a document with my signature, but Clara, who'd seen my handwriting on countless Christmas cards, knew it was a forgery. The news hit like a punch, stealing my breath. Darren, the boy I'd raised, who'd slept in my arms during thunderstorms, was trying to strip me of my home, my freedom. I sat on my bed, the quilt bunched under my hands, and stared at the framed photo of Darren's high school graduation on my dresser. I'd worked night shifts at the factory to pay for his tuition, my hands calloused from the looms, my dreams pinned on his future. Now, at 45, he was betraying me. Tears pricked my eyes, but I blinked them away. I couldn't break, not yet. I pulled out my notebook and wrote down Clara's words, the date of Darren's filing, the courthouse details. My pen shook, but my resolve didn't. Miranda grew bolder, as if sensing my discovery. She left brochures for nursing homes on the kitchen table, their glossy covers showing smiling elders in pristine lounges. Paradise Pines, one read, promising care and comfort. I found them Thursday morning while making biscuits, the flour dusting my hands as I flipped through the pages. Miranda walked in, her heels clicking, and smiled, saying they were just ideas for my well-being. Her voice was smooth, but her eyes were cold, like she was sizing me up. I nodded, sliding the brochures into a drawer, and kept kneading the dough, my knuckles white. Tessa, eating cereal at the counter, watched us. Her spoon paused, her face tight with worry. That evening, the air in the bungalow felt charged, like before a lightning strike. I was in the living room, mending a tear in Tessa's jacket when Darren came home. He dropped his keys on the sideboard, the clatter loud in the quiet, and stood in the doorway, his frame filling the space. Miranda sat on the couch, her phone down for once, her hands folded. Tessa was in the garden, her silhouette visible through the window, picking zinnias under the dusk sky. Darren cleared his throat, his voice low but firm. "Mama, we need to talk," he said. I set my needle down, my heart pounding, and looked at him, my son, his face a mask of determination. He stepped closer, his work boots scuffing the rug, and said, "We need this house, Mama. Miranda and we're stuck, but we can start over if we sell it. You'd be better off in a place with folks your age, somewhere safe." His words landed like stones, each one sinking deeper. Miranda nodded, adding, "It's about what's best for everyone." I sat still, my hands clasped, the jacket forgotten in my lap. Tessa burst through the back door, her flowers dropping to the floor, her voice sharp. "How can you say that, Papa? This is Ba's home." Her eyes blazed, but Darren didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on me. I stood, my legs steady despite the tremor in my chest, and faced him. "This is my home, Darren," I said, my voice clear, cutting through the tension. "I'm not going anywhere." His jaw tightened, and Miranda's smile vanished, her lips a thin line. Tessa moved to my side, her hand brushing mine, her breath quick. Darren opened his mouth, then closed it, turning away. Miranda followed him, her heels sharp against the floor, and the door to their room slammed shut. Tessa hugged me, her arms tight, and I held her, my strength drawn from her trust. Later, in the quiet of my room, I pulled an old cassette recorder from a drawer, its plastic scratched from years of disuse. I'd bought it in the 90s to record James's sermons for the church, his voice now just a memory. I tested it, the red light flickering, and hid it in my apron pocket. If Darren spoke like that again, I'd have proof. I sat at my desk, the lamp casting a soft glow, and added to my notebook. Darren's words, Miranda's nod, Tessa's cry. Clara had texted earlier, urging me to gather evidence. Bank statements, letters, anything to build a case. She was already drafting a letter to the courthouse, challenging the power of attorney. I lay awake that night, the cicadas loud outside, my mind racing. The betrayal was no longer a shadow. It was real, spoken aloud in my own home. Darren's face, so like James's but harder, haunted me. I thought of the sacrifices, nights without sleep, meals skipped to pay his way, and felt a fire kindling inside. Clara's voice echoed in my head. "We'll fight this, Evelyn." I believed her. I wasn't just fighting for my house, I was fighting for myself, for Tessa, for the life I'd built. The recorder sat on my nightstand, a small weapon in the battle ahead. They'd underestimated me, but I was ready to show them who I was. The days after Darren's betrayal in the living room blurred into a storm of action, my heart a mix of hurt and resolve. I filed a lawsuit against him for fraud and forgery. The decision made in Clara's cramped home office, her desk piled with legal pads and coffee mugs. Clara, her silver hair pulled into a tight bun, worked with the fire of her younger years, her fingers flying over documents. She gathered my bank statements, showing withdrawals Darren hadn't explained, and the cassette recording of his demand to sell my house, his voice cold and clear. She tracked down neighbors, Miss Lorraine from across the street, who'd seen Darren with a slick-haired realtor in a suit, and Mr. Jenkins, who'd overheard Miranda bragging about big plans at the corner store. Each piece was a brick in the case we built, and I felt my strength returning, like roots reaching deeper into the earth. Miranda learned of the lawsuit through a courthouse clerk, a friend of Clara's who'd seen the filing. She stormed into the kitchen that evening, her face flushed, her voice a whip. "You're tearing this family apart, Evelyn," she shouted, slamming her hand on the counter, the dishes rattling. "How can you be so selfish?" I stood by the stove, stirring a pot of collards, the steam rising between us. I met her eyes, her anger a mirror to my own, and said nothing. My silence unnerved her. She faltered, her hands dropping to her sides, and left the room, her heels echoing. Darren wasn't home. He'd taken to staying out late, his truck absent until midnight. I turned back to the stove, my hands steady, knowing silence was my shield for now. Tessa, my rock, refused to sleep in her parents' room after that night. She moved her things into my bedroom, her clothes folded in a corner, her poetry notebook on my dresser. We shared my double bed, her warmth beside me a comfort in the dark. During the day, she followed me to the garden, her sneakers muddy as we planted new magnolia saplings along the fence. "They're like us, Ba," she said, patting the soil, her smile fierce. "They grow no matter what." I hugged her, the scent of earth on her hands grounding me. Her loyalty was a light in the chaos, and I vowed to protect her as fiercely as I protected my home. The court date arrived 2 weeks later, a humid morning in late August. The Dothan courthouse was a squat brick building, its air conditioning wheezing against the heat. I wore my Sunday dress, navy with a white collar, my hair pinned neatly. Clara sat beside me, her briefcase bulging, her presence a steady anchor. Darren and Miranda arrived late, him in a wrinkled shirt, her in a tight dress, both avoiding my gaze. The courtroom was small, the wooden benches worn, the judge a woman with gray streaks in her hair and eyes that missed nothing. Clara presented our case, the forged power of attorney, the bank letter, the recording, the neighbor's statements. I sat straight, my hands clasped as Darren took the stand, claiming he'd acted out of concern for my health. His voice shook, his story thin, and the judge's frown deepened. Miranda didn't testify, her silence loud in the room. The judge ruled swiftly, her voice firm. The power of attorney was voided, the house remained mine, and Darren and Miranda were ordered to vacate within 30 days. I exhaled, the weight lifting, though my heart still ached. Darren's shoulders slumped as he left the courtroom, Miranda trailing him, her face pale. Clara squeezed my hand, her smile small but triumphant. Outside, the sun was merciless, but I felt lighter, the air cleaner. Tessa, waiting on a bench, ran to me, her arms wide. "We did it, Ba," she whispered, and I held her, my tears held back, but close. Miranda's anger spilled online that night. She posted on social media, calling me a bitter old woman who'd destroyed her own son. Her words spread, and by morning, neighbors whispered at the gas station, their glances sharp. Miss Lorraine stopped by with a pound cake, her loyalty unwavering. But others kept their distance, their trust swayed by Miranda's lies. I ignored the chatter, focusing on Tessa, who countered with a poem on her own account. She wrote of a grandmother holding the sky, her words raw and true, shared hundreds of times by strangers. Reading it on her phone, I felt pride swell, her courage a mirror to mine. I sat at my kitchen table that evening, a blank sheet of paper before me. Clara had suggested I share my story, not for revenge, but to warn others. I wrote a letter to the Dothan Eagle, anonymous, about elders betrayed by family, their homes stolen by greed. My pen moved slowly, each word a release of the pain I'd carried. I described the signs, whispers, forged papers, false concern, urging others to check their deeds, to trust their instincts. I sealed the envelope, my hand steady, and dropped it in the mailbox the next day, the act a quiet rebellion. Back in the garden, I pruned the magnolias, the shears heavy in my hands. Tessa joined me, her laughter soft as we watered the new saplings. The lawsuit was won, but the war wasn't over. Miranda's posts, Darren's silence, the neighbors' stares, they were clouds on the horizon. Yet as I looked at Tessa, her face lit by the setting sun, I knew I wasn't just fighting for my bungalow. I was fighting for my right to exist, to be seen, to stand tall. The magnolias bloomed, their petals bright against the dusk, and I felt their strength in me, a storm rising, ready to break. The morning after Darren and Miranda's departure, the bungalow felt like it could breathe again, its walls no longer holding their tension. I stood on the veranda, coffee mug in hand, watching the Dothan sunrise paint the magnolias gold. The gravel driveway was empty, Darren's truck gone, along with the boxes they'd packed in haste. Tessa slept in my room, her soft snores a reminder of the new life we were building. I sipped my coffee, the bitterness grounding me, and felt a quiet peace settle over the house, like dust after a storm. Tessa and I turned the bungalow into our sanctuary. The first week, we scrubbed every corner, the scent of pine cleaner replacing Miranda's perfume. Tessa dragged the vacuum across the living room rug, her braids swinging, while I polished the windows until they gleamed. We laughed over small things, her tripping over the hose in the garden, my burning a batch of biscuits. In the kitchen, I taught her my mother's cornbread recipe, measuring flour by feel, not cups. She watched, her hands clumsy but eager, as I showed her how to mix the batter until it was just right. We ate the warm slices with butter, sitting at the table, her chatter about school filling the silence. I told her stories of Dothan in the 1960s, of marches and church meetings, of women like my mother who stood tall against injustice. Her eyes widened, her poet's heart soaking in every word, and I saw her pride in our shared roots. I met with Clara to revise my will, a task I delayed too long. We sat in her office, the air thick with the smell of old books, and I laid out my wishes. The bungalow and most of my savings, modest but enough, would go to Tessa when she turned 21, held in trust to keep it safe. I wanted her to have the chance I'd fought for, a foundation to chase her dreams. The rest, a few $1,000s, I donated to a new program through the community center, one I named Magnolia Hope. It would help elders like me, betrayed by family, offering legal aid and support groups. Clara wrote it all down, her pen steady, and when I signed the papers, I felt a weight lift, my legacy secured not in anger, but in love. Miranda's letter arrived a week later, slipped through the mail slot in a cream envelope. I found it on the floor, her cursive neat but unfamiliar. She apologized, her words polished, claiming stress had driven her actions, begging for a chance to rebuild. I read it once, standing by the sink, then folded it and tucked it into a drawer, unopened again. Her remorse was hollow, a performance for her own conscience. I didn't reply, choosing silence over confrontation. Tessa saw the envelope and asked if it was from her mother. I shook my head and she didn't press, her loyalty to me unspoken but fierce. One afternoon, Tessa rummaged in the basement, her curiosity pulling her to the boxes I'd rarely touched. She emerged with a stack of photographs, their edges curled, and held up one of James, my husband, in his Sunday suit, grinning by the magnolias. "Tell me about Grandpa," she said, settling on the couch, her knees tucked under her. I sat beside her, the photo in my hands, and spoke of James, his laugh, his love for jazz, the way he'd carried me over the threshold of this bungalow. I told her of the sacrifices, the nights I worked while he watched Darren, the dreams we built into these walls. Tessa listened, her eyes bright, and when I finished, she hugged me, whispering, I want to be like you, Ba. I saw her future in that moment, strong and unyielding, and my heart swelled. The community began to shift toward me, the sting of Miranda's posts fading. My letter in the Dothan Eagle, published anonymously, struck a chord. Neighbors, some who'd once whispered, now stopped by with gifts. Miss Lorraine brought a bouquet of daisies, her smile warm, saying she'd known I was right all along. Mr. Jenkins dropped off a pecan pie, his voice gruff as he praised my courage. Others, strangers even, left notes in my mailbox, sharing their own stories of family betrayal. I read each one, sitting on the veranda, the evening air sweet with magnolia blooms. I planted new flowers along the steps, marigolds and petunias, their colors bright against the peeling paint, a promise of renewal. Darren called one evening, his number flashing on my phone as I peeled potatoes. I answered, my voice steady, expecting nothing. He spoke softly, his words halting, saying he was sorry that he'd lost his way. I listened, the knife still in my hand, but felt no pull to forgive. His apology was too late, a shadow of the boy I'd raised. I told him I wished him well and hung up, the click final. Tessa, doing homework at the table, looked up but said nothing, her silence a shared understanding. My life was no longer his to shape. I spent my days with Tessa, our rhythm steady. We gardened, her hands learning the soil, and cooked, the kitchen alive with our laughter. I hung Tessa's poems on the fridge, her words a daily gift. The bungalow, once a battleground, became a home again, its walls holding our stories. I sat on the veranda each night, the stars bright above, and felt my voice returning, not just in words, but in the life I was building. Tessa, my garden, my community, they were my truth now, and I held them close, a new dawn breaking over the life I'd reclaimed. A year had passed since Darren's call, and the bungalow stood stronger under the Dothan sun, its blue paint touched up by Tessa and me during a weekend of laughter and spilled cans. I stood in the fellowship hall of Bethel Church, the air cool with the hum of ceiling fans, facing rows of faces, elders, neighbors, strangers, at a forum on senior rights. My hands rested on the podium, steady despite the weight of memory, and I shared my story. I spoke of betrayal, of a son who'd forged papers to take my home, of the fight to reclaim what was mine. My voice carried, clear and calm, no tears in my eyes. People listened, some nodding, others scribbling notes, their eyes reflecting shared pain or quiet respect. When I finished, applause rose, soft but warm, and I stepped down, my heart full, knowing I'd planted seeds of courage. Tessa, now 17 and a high school senior, had become my partner in this work. She'd enrolled in community college courses, her poetry sharper with each class, and she helped run Magnolia Hope, the program I'd funded. The initiative had grown beyond my dreams, its budget bolstered by my donation and local grants. We hired lawyers to help elders fight family fraud, their offices buzzing with cases like mine. We hosted evenings at the community center, where men and women, their hair gray or gone, shared stories over iced tea and pound cake. I listened, my chair pulled close, as they spoke of children who'd taken savings, homes, dignity. Each story echoed mine, and I offered what I'd learned. Check your deeds, keep records, trust your strength. Tessa took notes, her pen flying, planning ways to expand the program, her energy a fire that warmed me. My bungalow became the heart of these gatherings. The veranda, once my solitary refuge, now held folding chairs and tables draped in checkered cloths. Neighbors and strangers filled the space, their voices mingling with the chirp of crickets. We held potlucks, plates piled with fried chicken and collards, and storytelling nights where elders laughed and cried, their lives woven into Dothan's tapestry. Tessa strung fairy lights along the railing, their glow soft against the magnolias, and I watched her move through the crowd, her smile bright, her confidence a mirror of the woman I'd become. Miss Lorraine called it Evelyn's ministry, and though I laughed, the word settled deep, a truth I hadn't named. Tessa's poetry had bloomed, too. At Dothan's annual arts festival, she took the stage in the town square, her notebook trembling in her hands, but her voice steady. She read a poem dedicated to me, Woman of Magnolias, its lines painting me as a tree, roots unyielding, branches reaching for the sky. The crowd, gathered on blankets under oak trees, clapped long and loud, and I sat in the front row, my eyes misty but proud. She ran to me after, her arms wide, and I held her, whispering, "You're my strength, girl." In her, I saw myself fierce, unbroken, a woman who'd learned to stand tall. Darren had faded from my life. His calls stopped. His presence a shadow I no longer chased. Word reached me through Miss Lorraine that Miranda had left Dothan, her social media silent, her whereabouts unknown. I felt no triumph, only relief, their absence of space for new growth. I sold a strip of the backyard to a young couple building next door. The money poured into Magnolia Hope for more legal aid and a van to drive elders to appointments. In that sold earth, I planted a magnolia sapling, its tag reading for Tessa, a gift for her 18th birthday. She knelt beside me as we set its roots, her hands gentle, and we watered it together, the soil dark under our fingers. Each morning, I carried my coffee to the veranda, the mug warm in my hands, and listened to the birds, their songs sharp in the dawn. The garden thrived, marigolds and zinnias bright, the magnolias heavy with blooms. Tessa often joined me, her textbook spread on the table, her laughter light as we planned her college applications. She wanted to study literature, to write, to carry our stories forward. I watched her, my heart steady, knowing she'd inherit not just the bungalow but the resilience I'd forged. Neighbors passed by waving, their respect earned through my fight, their casseroles and smiles a quiet apology for past doubts. The bungalow was more than a house now, it was a legacy. Its walls held Tessa's poems, pinned beside James's old photos, and its rooms echoed with the voices of those we'd helped. I sat on the veranda one evening, the air cool, the fairy lights glowing, and felt a peace I hadn't known in years. My life, my garden, my granddaughter, my voice, was mine, shaped by my hands, unbroken by betrayal. The magnolias stood tall, their light catching the stars, and I knew their glow would never fade, a beacon for me, for Tessa, for all who'd find their way here.